Well, hello. Today we're speaking with Dom Robinson from UK. And Rob is a founder of Ideas Company, which is a company in the industry of video streaming. And Dom, could you please tell me more about what your company does?
Yeah, sure. So I've been working with streaming for about 25, 30 years now. I think I did my first image transfer over an IP network in 1990 before the web existed, taking images off CCDs on telescopes while I was doing some helping out with some research in astrophysics at a local university. But by the mid 90s, I discovered real audio and started. I was spending a lot of my time producing raves and drum and bass events. So quite interested in live production and started using live streaming technologies. Right, yeah, 1996, I think I did my first webcast. Very quickly started working for a lot of the London production companies who were starting to explore live streaming and live webcasting. Which escalated into putting Number 10 Downing Street, Parliament, Glastonbury, bits of the BBC, and then Sky Sports Online through a whole chain of different events and so on. So very much saw the streaming industry appear around me. Right, I feel like I was one of the first people in the sector, and it's grown up around me. Along the way in 2001, I was getting a bit frustrated with having to constantly use CDNs that were based in the States. So I built one of the first CDNs certainly in the UK, if not in Europe, called Global Mix, which was focused on multicast and was very much about network efficiency, and that's remained close to my heart, and I'll come back to that in a moment. By the end of 2009, the big US CDNs were really getting their boots on the ground over here in Europe, and I could see the writing on the wall for my little CDN, so I switched. And I formed Ideas with two very sharp colleagues who were primary developers, who'd been writing fintech and banking software, serial entrepreneurs who'd built up software in the fintech and retail environment, but were very interested in some of the challenges that the media industry faced. We didn't want to be systems integrators. We wanted to be primary developers and produce our own tool set. Which we wrote in a language called Erlang, which is a little bit esoteric. We, over the following decade, up until, well, we still are Ideas, we started delivering high availability live streaming platforms for the likes of what was Thomson Reuters, became NASDAQ notified, and so on. So we do about 75,000 live events a year with those guys. We also helped DAZN provide a lot of their core mezzanine encoding and remote commentary workflows. We do specialist work around the live streaming space. And then in the last year, we've been re-gearing a little bit, and we're just bringing to market a new product called Norsk, which allows developers who don't code in Erlang and don't code in PureScript in these unusual languages, but to actually deploy very high availability, high scale live streaming workflows, which can start in the production and take you right through to the distribution end of the piece. And that's coming to market as we speak. So that's the background of Ideas. Along the way, I've also written for Streaming Media Magazine since 2002. And I've written for Wiley Press, written a couple of books on CDNs and streaming and so on. And then a little bit more recently, about 10 years ago, I started chairing CDN conferences, culminating in running the Content Delivery Summit, which was based in New York. And through discussions in those conferences, I became interested in the fact that sustainability really wasn't on the radar of the engineers and the architects in the industry. So I started encouraging conversation in that, and then about 18 months ago, that kind of exploded around me, and I founded Greening of Streaming, which is now exploded into, it takes up about a third of my time running Greening of Streaming, which is quite exciting and not entirely expected, but it feels noble and it feels like a good cause to be promoting. So there you go. A 5-minute history.
Yeah, great. And maybe for the wide audience and people who are not professionals in the video industry, you can explain why unicast is extremely bad in terms of green and extremely dangerous for the planet when via unicast millions of people all over the world are watching something. Why is it so important to become more green, and why unicasting is dangerous?
I think dangerous might be a bit of a hyperbole, but it's certainly the normal way to do things. I think part of the attraction of the internet is it allows you to deliver network services which are essentially uniquely tailored to each end user. So it's not a broadcast medium where everyone gets the same transmission like an old radio station or an old TV station. Unicast essentially lets you create a networked connection to sources of information which are of specific interest to the user at that particular point in time. And that requirement means that you have to have computers which can terminate the request for the connection on a one-to-one basis. And so when you're trying to scale out things like video on demand or things like web services or interactive search or e-commerce and so on, Unicast is really the only way you can do things. So while I suppose you could say it's dangerous, I think that might be hyperbole. I think it's a necessity in order to deliver many of the services that we try to use. However, that's not to say that when we try to deliver services like broadcast on the internet, that there aren't more efficient ways to do things. And so when we try to deliver the same piece of information to many people at the same time, there are some alternatives. One of my favorites is multicast, and my own CDN, Global Mix, was the multicast internet exchange. We were one of the first at-scale CDNs delivering multicast, possibly 20 years too early. But it was much, much more efficient. The network sees a 1 megabit stream as 1 megabit passing through every node rather than 1 megabit per user. And that takes out some of the requirement to include servers in the network that repeat the signal. It doesn't really change the network energy, but it does change the amount of energy you need in layer 4 to manage and supervise the unicasting. You can essentially turn those off. So there are some real advantages with multicasting. However, there are some real disadvantages. True multicasting is it's treated as a dark art because of some of its historic challenges. And it also faces an interesting conundrum, which is sometimes inefficiency makes people money. And so deploying multicast might be much more efficient, but there are people who sell unicast bandwidth who really have little or no interest in losing that revenue. So there are supply and demand challenges within the economics that means that sometimes network efficiency is not economically the option that people want to go down. So interesting challenges anyway.
And so what is about your green streaming project? Is it a new technology or something else?
No, so Greening of Streaming is a members association. We're up to about 24, 25 members at the moment. We have formed around many of the CDN architects and streaming technology vendors in the industry wanting to start to look at energy efficiency in their workflows and in their services and technology. It's important to set a bit of perspective. So telcos and data centers and so on have been thinking about energy efficiency for 15, 20 years. It's part of the fabric that they built with. Streaming doesn't really have a physical fabric in a typical way. It's an application which runs over many different systems. And so for the first 10, 12 years that I was involved in CDNs, all the engineers and my peers in other companies, we were interested in price. So CDNs essentially are collections of proxy servers which allow you to deliver information at a remote location without having to go all the way back to the origin repeatedly. And when those origins might have been over transatlantic fibers, which were very expensive to get access to, it was useful to have a proxy server in London to look at the front page of, New York Times website, rather than constantly go across the Atlantic to watch the same information. So we'd copy the data once over the Atlantic and then proxy that, use a server that was in London to deliver that to the London audience and save money on that transoceanic fiber. That works. That was the business model, and that was what happened with CDNs for the first 10 to 12 years. But prices went from $1.50, $2 per gigabyte of data transfer when I first started. They dropped rapidly, and now it's less than a hundredth of a penny for the same amount of data. By 2007, 2008, the market was really reaching an affordable scale for people to deliver high enough qualities of video from these CDNs, of content delivery networks, of proxy servers, to actually start to engage really big audiences watching very fat bandwidth content like video. At which point you start seeing Netflix, you start seeing YouTube really starting to mature. And so from 2008 to 2000, really now to 2020, the last 12 years has all been about performance. So we moved from the first P, price, into the second P, which is performance. And we've worked really hard to make sure that the performance and the quality of the service has been exceptionally good for the consumer to really reach mass adoption, and for the great stories that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years with the big unicorn blue chip broadcasters arriving online, become success stories. But we never as an industry had a chance until really 18 months ago to stop and think, okay, we've been working really hard to make the economics of this work. Then we've been working really hard to make the performance of the industry engaging and work so that it's just snappy and everyone gets an experience that they engage with. Now let's stop and think for a moment about how energy efficient we are. And as we stopped to think about it, what we realized was that the telcos we were running on and the data centers we were running through and hosting infrastructure in, those guys had some sort of handle on things, but we weren't necessarily designing our infrastructure thinking about power, thinking about energy. And when we started that conversation as the Greening of Streaming, initially a very informal group, and it's now grown to a reasonably substantial, essentially a members association, a members group, we realized that we were using an enormous amount of energy, and we influence really a significant amount of energy. Now you'll notice I'm being careful about saying how little, how much. Greening of Streaming as a group has one rule, and that is no greenwashing. We don't really accept most of the data that has been produced. It's all interesting and all being produced with noble intent, but it's not very complete, and the industry itself doesn't really yet know how much energy it actually uses on a component by component or service by service basis. The one set of figures we generally accept is that around 3% of all world energy is used by information and computing technology. That's reasonably well supported data from many academics and from the IEA and others, the International Energy Association and others. Cisco has a figure that 70 to 80% of network traffic is video streaming. So if you wave your hand in the air and put those two things together, those two facts together, we as a group would accept that video streaming is probably driving a demand for between 1% and 2% of all world energy at the moment. And yet
there's the solution? What to do with it?
So, well, the first stage is to understand what it really is and understand what challenges we're actually facing. So a lot of the work that's been going on in Greening of Streaming has been to come up with an agreement in terms and the measures and what we're trying to measure. We're largely focused on wattage at the moment rather than carbon. We aren't carbon engineers. We don't understand carbon accounting. We do understand watts. We really understand watts because our computers run on those, and we have electricity bills, and we can work to reduce those electricity bills, and that has a benefit of actually, in many interpretations, reducing carbon, and that's that's a good thing. You know, we are trying not to burn a hole in the planet, but we don't really care whether our energy is green or red or what color the electrons are. We want to optimize the efficiency of our networks so that they're as low cost and efficient to run as possible, which has really struck a chord. You know, when people have got many hundreds of millions of pounds of a quarter energy bills in order to deliver these services, trying to make that more efficient really wins the engineer, wins the finance director, and wins the ESG, the environmental and strategic governance, sustainability governance communities together. So we've really brought together a community of people focused on engineering these systems for better power. In terms of practical things, what can we do? We're having discussions about looking at what's good enough. So normalizing around HD or 2K and looking at making sure that your typical service just targets 2K. And if you want to watch 4K, maybe the user has to lean in and opt into that and might expect a startup delay because you're not pre-caching it and running many expensive caches. We're exploring these ideas. It's not an edict yet. We're looking at challenges that we might face in making claims that we've reduced the power of an encoder at the core of a network, but that's had the knock-on effect of increasing the power of millions of decoders in client devices and so on. So we have to look at whether we at a systemic level, whether we're making the right decisions and putting the efficiencies in the right place. So it's a complicated beast. And I'm proud that Greening and Streaming has created the forum for those conversations and is invigorating and challenging the industry to come together, drop its swords in those competitive level, in that competitive sense, and find and share and develop best practice around how to improve energy efficiency in that ecosystem, and hopefully take us from maybe 2% down to 1% of world energy, while maintaining the quality of experience for the consumer and helping the world use tools like video conferencing so that we don't have to get in cars and travel around all the time and things.
I have heard several times such an opinion about telcos and ISPs that they are not interested in green things at all. So they're thinking about their revenue right now, and they're not thinking too much about these green things. How are you going to change their opinion or their behavior in this?
So they weren't thinking about them, and then we had a bit of an energy crisis. And now they're thinking about it a lot. So the traditional answer from the telco and the ISP is, oh, well, we'll just buy green electrons. Our view is that our view as Greening and Streaming is we want to drive a culture through the engineers of being good energy citizens. So it doesn't really matter where you get your electrons from. If you hoard all of them for your service, then your mum won't be able to heat her house. So we're trying to actually foster a sort of from the workshop work, the engineer floor upwards. We are just going to design these things better because it's an engineering challenge. The ISP governance, the shareholders, they can not care if they like, but their engineers are going to care because their engineers do care, whether it's for financial reasons or whether it's because they want to heat their mum's home instead of heat servers in a data center. Or whether it's because they care about the environment. The engineers are going to do it anyway, and that's very empowering for engineers. So yes, some people might throw it over their shoulder and not care, but the great thing about being an engineer is we have that control and we can make that decision. So
okay, and for example, let's say I'm an owner of a telco or an ISP, and in practical steps, what can I do right now inside my ISP or inside my telco for me to make smaller the energy consumption?
It's a great question. At the moment, we don't really know where the high impact is being burnt, but one of the most important and simplest things is, and this pervades from the consumer through to the data center owner, through to the telco, is learn how to turn off infrastructure you're not using. We've spent a lot of time talking about virtualization over the last decade and about network function virtualization, about software-defined networkings and so on. But most people, even in the cloud, most people only talk about scaling up. Actually, the cloud is not an efficient system when you're just scaling up. You might as well do things on-prem. The cloud becomes really, really useful when you turn things off. You can, if you have a very volatile traffic load, you have to turn off the servers as your traffic drops. You bring your capacity down. Because of service level agreements between operators, CDNs, telcos, and everyone provisions everything for peak all the time. They like to boast about their aggregate capacity, and they send a lot of zeros. You see 5G networks saying that they're most efficient per gigabit, but the only thing people are doing on 5G networks at speed is speed testing. If you're not using it, don't operate it. Don't use 5 times as much power to send zeros all the time. You know, just turn it off if you're not using, and learn how to use network orchestration, all of these great techniques we've been developing over the last decade. Learn how to actually put them into practice, and don't run pipes hot just because it's easier than going and turning them off and on as traffic loads come in. Work with your customers so that they understand that sometimes they might need to ring you up and say, we're expecting some spiky load, and you might not be ready for that, but make them get you ready by warning you if they can. Don't just turn on your 100 terabit port in case, because that's running energy, that's running networks, that's running network demand hot for no benefit. And don't always default to the next latest, greatest 8K, 16K, 5G, 120 frames a second feature just because you think consumers are going to want it. Check with them whether they're really going to get value out of it. Make it something that you can opt into. That's the beauty of the internet. But don't make it your default service, because you're really just burning energy for your marketing rather than for the benefit of the customers, and potentially that could be at the detriment of your energy bill and the environment.
And you recently visited IBC, right?
I did, yeah.
And what major trends did you detect? Maybe something changed in comparison with previous years.
For me, normally I've been talking about high availability live streaming systems, and for me I couldn't move because greening of streaming sort of running ahead of me a little bit. So I have a biased view that everybody wants to talk about sustainability and streaming and so on. That's my perspective, and I accept that. I think there has been a move to fast services, and I think that's symptomatic of the fact that the ad industry has lost interest in traditional broadcast panel measurement, and they found more faith in streaming ad measurement. And I think that we're going to start seeing a more and more ad revenue spent around streaming. So it's encouraging the growth of fast services. I don't know how much they're here to stay or not. I'm not a great fan. I like my subscriber services because I don't like adverts, and I'll wear that on my sleeve. The other thing that I think is very interesting is live streaming is coming of age. Obviously, that's always in my heart. I'm a live streamer by trade, but I think the traditional linear live TV broadcasting is now finding its place in the streaming context, in the streaming bouquet, and we're going to see more and more of that real-time one-to-many and indeed many-to-many sort of interactive service technology appearing. I think notably, I don't think metaverse, I don't think the sort of Web3 stuff is really finding traction despite a lot of hype. And I think that some uses of deep edge computing, like in transport and in complex moving environments, are really taking off. But other static edge computing systems in the MEC and RAN environments are finding less traction than they're expecting. So those were my observations at IBC.
If a company needs a streaming platform to acquire or to find a vendor for streaming, how can they make choice based on which criteria?
I would start with referrals. If you can find a service which is like the one you're thinking of building, and the people who've built that service can vouch for the technology providers, referral is definitely the best way forward. There are, especially since the pandemic, there was a big influx of people getting into the streaming industry. So there's a big cloud of marketing material. Lots of people just copy and paste each other's marketing and pretend they know what they're doing and frankly haven't got much experience, acumen, or even an understanding of what they're doing, or they're just reselling something on a white label basis. So talk to people who are really operating services and get their recommendations. I would honestly recommend that as the first path of action. Yes, the analysts help. Yes, the press helps. But it's got to be word of mouth as the first port of call. Go to conferences, talk to people, go to online sessions, network with people, and ask people who've been in the industry and are using the services.
And what about choosing a CDN vendor? Like the same approach, or?
I want to say something strange here. So you only hear about CDNs when they go wrong. And we don't hear about CDNs very much unless they go wrong. So I think it's quite difficult if you try a CDN out and it seems to be doing what you need it to do. It's quite difficult to argue against it being able to do what you need it to do unless you can actually load it up with too much traffic and kill its capacity. There was a lot of effort in multi-CDN switching and trying to measure performance metrics that frankly started to split hairs, which I personally have doubts about. And it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about the history of the CDN. The CDN's history was about price, not about performance. Mm-hmm. Performance became a way to differentiate when everybody got to a commoditized price. But actually, performance when you're splitting millisecond hairs, it's very rare that it really matters. Actually, what matters is that you have a good relationship with the CDN, and that they are, ultimately reliably there. And if they're not reliably there, you'll know about it before you take a contract out with them. So everyone has a bad day. You have to be good on a bad day. That's been my company's motto for a decade. But it's rare these days that CDNs have outages. And in terms of differentiated services because of a few microseconds of latency, I can't think of a single service where that matters. So yeah, I think it's about a commercial engagement and about liking working with them, feeling that they support you well.
And if you had 50 billion euro to invest in a technology related somehow to digital video, into which technology would you have invested?
50 million or 50 billion?
Billion. 50.
50 billion. So I would be personally investing heavily in sustainability. It's probably unsurprising that I say that, but there is no innovation really of any note going on in the streaming industry around latency, around performance at the moment. Everybody's been splitting hairs for a decade. The really open playing field for innovation is in sustainability. We can do the same things, deliver streams that are arriving on time and looking great. We can do those things, but we can completely re-engineer how we're doing those at the moment. And that has a lot of scope for a return on investment. 50 billion, I don't know. Those are really B2C sort of ad or subscriber revenue propositions. Not really my world, but in terms of 50 million under the hood, yeah, I think there's a lot of spaces where we could be really investing strongly in innovation. And of course, there's also my company would be very happy to receive an investment of 50 million or 50 billion and deliver live streaming workflows at scale for more and more customers.
Yeah, and historically we had IPTV, then OTT, and what could be next evolutionary step after OTT in some future, if we imagine?
I don't know. I think there's a migration of traditional broadcast paradigms onto the internet. I think some of that is just some of what's been going on is just a movement of services into a different network paradigm from private networks, broadcast networks into IP domains and so on. I'm not a great believer that people, certainly families and couples and people in relationships, I'm not a great believer that they want to spend time in company wearing goggles. I think that's why 3D TV failed, and I don't really think that the metaverse per se is going to take off beyond maybe singles. If I'm really brutally honest, I think people who live on their own probably find a lot of solace in being in virtual worlds and gaming worlds. So I think there's still, still a lot of legs in the gaming world and so on to grow. But I think the immediate growth is going to be in live linear services actually not dying, but moving to the internet. And people rediscovering scheduled broadcasting a little bit and finding it's fun to say, oh, I'm watching this, or did you see that last night? Then I say that, but my kids haven't got a clue what that's about. And so maybe I'm completely getting too old for this game. I don't know. I don't invest in those sort of spaces. So.
Yeah, and what are the future trends? What we will see in 20, 30 years?
So I think we might well see a lot more sparing use of the networks. I think we might find that we, as a culture, probably want to get away from the network a little bit more. So I think the idea of fixed networks with high capacity in the home or in the workplace will become the norm. But I have a funny sensation that people will want to get away. So I think strangely, I think things like smartwatches and some wearables, which just keep us just at a light level in touch, will become more important. And we'll discover we'll be leaving our phone and our immersive environments behind. That, if you like, a backlash on people sitting doing this while they're trying to have a conversation with people, because I think people are just gradually rediscovering after the lockdowns, they're rediscovering that face-to-face communication is actually very valuable. It's a very nice experience, and I think that technology that supports our experience in those ways will probably last longer than technology which fights to drag our engagement into someone else's ad revenue model.
Is there something that we didn't discuss, but what should be mentioned? Something important maybe we forgot to mention?
You've asked me a lot of things about the consumer experience, and it's not really my end. I'm used to seeing a consumer problem being put in front of me as an engineer and working out how to deliver high volumes of streaming to it. So I sort of conjectured a little bit outside of my scope. In terms of the core engineering, I think we're going to see some interesting developments in the production space and in how production is enabled. And how people can tell stories using video, and how people can incorporate video in their day-to-day communications, and so on, much more. And I think they're going to be subtle. I think they're going to take a little while, and I hope that the focus of re-engineering, again, sorry to harp on about it, but the focus of re-engineering for energy efficiency will bring about changes in behavior, which will help us use these internet technologies as a whole to support our experience as humans on the planet, rather than to dominate that experience a bit more. So I think I'm vaguely optimistic about things at the moment. I think the generation I see coming through are not disappearing into social media in the way that their parents are, and I see my kids turning their media off and playing together in a way that actually, I think we don't think they do, because we're too busy tweeting away on WhatsApp and Facebook, Twitter, whatever it may be. We're not actually really following what the kids are doing. And I think there's a backlash coming, a little bit like every generation has a backlash. And I'm quite excited about that. I think of all social changes I've seen, I think the one that's coming through from kids at the moment is the one that really enthralls me. And I look forward to heading into my dotage, seeing how kids change the use of these tools into the things that they get some value from. So
yeah, well, thank you very much, Dom, and I hope next time we can speak about more deep tech engineering things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because you have such a huge amount of knowledge. Yeah, so we can.
I had to bite my lips on the IP multicast stuff, because
Yeah.
I can go into multicast very deep. I love IP multicast. It's my kink.
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. And thank you very much, Dom.
Not at all. Thank you.
Bye-bye.